There is a cafe near me that has a coffee drink special that is called the Swedish Latte that has maple syrup, cinnamon, cardamom, espresso. Oh my goodness, it is so delightful. And so in my mind, that combination of things has always been kind of Swedish coffee in my mind. I don't know how accurate that is. I've never been to Sweden. But I wanted to make a macaron like that and also come up with a really different decoration for the top. So I'm going to show you both the macaron shell and my decoration, and then also that filling flavor. Of course, in my home kitchen, I really love using the French method for meringue because it is so fast and easy. Room temperature egg whites, adding in the sugar and cream of tartar, streaming that in, and then I'm adding a little bit of Americolor gel, chocolate brown food coloring, just a little bit. What I wanted was a tan shell, and then after I get a really stiff peak and add in my dry ingredients, then I'm going to color a little bit of it a darker brown. What I want to create is sort of a very modern looking, funky, sketched version, like one line drawing coffee cup. And so that is why I wanted to go for a light brown shell, and then the darker brown is going to be kind of the coffee portion of the coffee cup, but in a little bit of an abstract way. If you don't want to putz around with this, or if you're a little bit nervous coloring your batter two different colors and you still want to get this look, you could also do this by creating the macaron shell and then using food coloring to paint on a little stripe of a brown where you want this same color to be. So you can use food coloring as a paint, or you could also use a bit of royal icing to paint on, or you could use chocolate or something. There are a lot of options if you want to adapt this a little bit differently from my method. So with my meringue here, you can see I've transferred it to a larger, wider bowl. That really helps me visualize as I am doing the mixing and macaronaging by hand. I like to add in the dry ingredients, the almond flour and powdered sugar, in about 3 additions. As soon as I get everything incorporated, then I am going to take out just a tiny bit and add some extra food coloring. Because I am adding food coloring more or less at the last minute here, I am going to be going with a gel food colorant. I find it's easier to have a really nice, even color that has perfectly distributed throughout all of the batter when you're mixing in a color at the last minute like this, to use gel. I love powdered food colorants, but if you mix it in at the very end just before you macaronage, I find that some of those flecks don't fully dissolve and you can end up with a little bit of streaky batter, which sometimes is super cool, but that was not what I wanted to go for. And that is why I'm using gel food coloring on purpose today, not just because I like it, which I do, but I purposefully chose the Americolor brown instead of the Sugar Art powdered food coloring. So as you can see here, I'm just adding a little bit more gel food coloring there into my little bowl of batter. It is quite tiny, I only need a little bit, and then I'm just going to finish the macaronage on both of these bowls. I really like to do that by pressing the batter against the sides of my bowl, swirling it around and kind of folding the batter back onto itself and pulling my spatula through. It can be really tricky to figure this out when you have such a small batch. I find that it's actually easier to macaronage when you have a larger batch. So that is another thing, that if you've been making really tiny batches of macarons and things aren't working out, I honestly recommend making a larger batch. It might actually be easier to visualize what is going on, what is the texture like. As you can see here with this larger bowl, it's already a little bit easier to understand what is going on in the bowl just because there's so much more of it. As soon as these are both to that really nice ribbon stage, I'm going to transfer the batter into 2 separate piping bags fitted with piping tips. Oftentimes for my regular circle macarons, I like to use an 803 or 804 piping tip, and then for the brown, I'm going to use one that's a bit smaller, probably an 802. But I could have gotten away with not using a piping tip on that one since I'm just piping a little kind of blob on the top. Today I am using a Silpat here, and I have a printed off template. I just found this on Google. You do not need to ask me for it. If you just type in Macaron circle template, you will find this. You'll be able to print it off. And so I'm just piping regular old circles here, and then on half of them I'm going to go over the top and pipe a little squiggle with that darker brown. Again, if you don't really want to mess with the two different tones of batter, you absolutely could just pipe regular old circles in this light brown or whatever color you want, and then go through later and paint the tops or whatever other method you want. These, even with those two different tones, I am going to do exactly what I always do. After everything is piped, I'm going to tap my tray a little bit. I will leave it to rest on my counter for about 20-25 minutes, and then I'm going to bake them at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for anywhere from 16 to 18 minutes. That works really well in my kitchen. For you, depending on where you live, how humid it is, what kind of oven you have, how many macs you're baking, what you're baking on, all of these different kinds of variables, you might end up baking or resting or any of these things a lot longer than me or a lot shorter than me. That is okay. It is normal that there is a big difference. As you can see here, as I put them in my oven, the reason I'm using an upside down tray is because sometimes that lip can cause some lopsided shells if it gets in the way of airflow in your oven. After letting those cool completely, I have a batch of royal icing that I've just colored kind of a really dark brown black color, and I'm going to use a kind of one line design style. So I'm not going to stop and start until I get to the, I guess, handle and the little base, but for most of the cup, I'm just using one line to create like an oval and then bring it down around to create like a coffee cup, and then on the one side a little handle, and then on the bottom a little base. Again, I wanted that kind of brown area to be this very abstract kind of where the coffee would be in a coffee cup, and the rest of the coffee cup is just kind of below it. I really liked this design. I thought it was really fun and cool and different. If you do not want to do this, obviously you can just pipe this onto your regular macaron shell, or you do not have to do any piping. This flavor kind of shines all by itself. It is really, really delicious. But I really love this. Let me know what you think about this design. It was very fun to do, and honestly, having some kind of like very simple one line design is really easy to do with royal icing. The more intricate you get, the harder it is, and I think the more often you have to pick up your piping bag, your piping of royal icing, the easier it is to get little like blobby things or have things not work out so well. So having like a one line design was really, really nice to work with. Royal icing for someone who's not as familiar with it. If you're new to royal icing, make sure to check out some of my other royal icing for beginners videos. For the filling here, I'm going with a Swiss meringue buttercream, and that is because I really love this method when I'm subbing out sugar for different things. Here I'm going with a buttercream that is egg whites, sugar, and maple syrup, as I mentioned before. Yes, you could use a maple extract, but whenever I can use the real thing, I really want to use the real thing. And then for spices, I'm using a ton of cinnamon and a ton of cardamom. I also have some espresso powder that is going in here, And I'm going to be adding a shot of espresso later on as well. So this is really heavily coffee flavored. If you wanted to remove the coffee, it's still going to be delicious. Maple, cinnamon, cardamom, it's still going to be an amazing buttercream. So if you are not a coffee lover, that's okay. But just know instead of a kind of Swedish latte or a spiced latte, it's going to taste more like a cinnamon roll. Okay. If you also wanted to, especially if you're taking out the coffee, I might recommend adding another layer of flavor with something like brown sugar or maple sugar or something to really develop that other kind of flavor that might be missing if you take out the coffee. I just had that on a double boiler to completely dissolve the sugar, get everything really nice and thinned down and warm. I heated it up until it was at 50 degrees Celsius, and then I've transferred that egg white sugar mixture into the bowl of my KitchenAid. You absolutely can do this with a hand mixer. There's no problem with that at all. It is actually quite easy to do. You could keep it in the same bowl. No worries. I'm going to continue whipping this on about a medium, maybe to medium high speed eventually. I'll increase it a little bit once it starts getting a little bit thicker. And I'm just going to whip this until it has cooled off to just above room temperature. And ideally by the time it has cooled off to that point, it should be looking really nice and fluffy and thick. It should look a lot lighter as it is already. It's looking kind of like a light tan instead of that darker brown we saw when it was in the double boiler. As soon as it reaches that point, I'm going to start adding in cubes of my room temperature butter. And I do get a lot of questions about butter. Is it important that it's room temperature? Does it have to be room temperature? Is it room temperature? Yes. If you are baking, unless a recipe specifically says cold butter, you can always assume that the chef intends for you to be using room temperature butter. The reason room temperature butter is really important here is because so we have this kind of warm meringue mixture. If you start adding in cold or even cool butter, that temperature difference and the texture difference is going to be a huge shock. And it's going to take a lot longer to nicely incorporate that cold butter than it would with a room temperature butter that is a lot closer both in temperature and in texture. A room temperature butter, you should be able to like gently press your finger into and it should just completely squish. If you touch cold butter or even cool butter, it's pretty firm, right? It's gonna take a lot more pressure to squish your finger into. Meringue is really light and fluffy and silky. So if we have room temperature butter, like actually room temperature butter, it's gonna be a lot closer to the texture of the meringue, which is going to make it a lot easier and faster to incorporate. As soon as I get all of the butter incorporated in here, I'm going to let it continue to whip for a little bit just to make sure it's like absolutely completely combined. Then I'm going to add in that last little bit of flavor with the espresso. And that too, don't pull your espresso shot or don't make your espresso shot like right before you want to add it in. Think about it. If you have hot coffee and you pour it into a mixture that's mostly butter, it's gonna get weird and melty. You want that espresso to be at least close to room temperature. It doesn't have to be chilled or cooled, but give it 5, 10, 15 minutes between making this shot of espresso and pouring it in. Yes, you could use a coffee concentrate or something like that if you do not have an espresso machine at home. No problem at all. That is totally okay. So here we go, pouring that espresso in here. And I know a lot of you are panicking right now, like, oh my God, you have this mixture that is just all fat and you poured a liquid in there. Why would you do that? It looks disgusting. No, give it a second. I promise you, I've done this so many times because I love coffee so much. It is going to incorporate. You just have to give it a minute. If you are baking in a really cold room, or if you are using buttercream that you made maybe the day before and you're re-whipping it as well, it might take longer. So if you have a mini blowtorch, like a creme brulee torch, take it to the outside of your bowl. Again, only do this if you're using a metal bowl like this or something that is, going to withstand the heat. Just take it to the outside of the bowl, or use a towel soaked in very hot water and hold it to the sides of your bowl. That heat can also help incorporate and really allow that mixture to combine. As you can see, it is all combined here. It is amazing and delectable. It is such a good buttercream. I could honestly just sit here and squeeze the piping bag just straight into my mouth. But I suppose we'll put them into macarons as an easier delivery system. I am just going for this buttercream. Again, it is so flavorful. It is so silky, texture, everything. It's just so good. If you wanted to go the next step, you could absolutely, if you want to layer in different flavors and textures, you could add a caramel in here. You could add a ganache in here if you want to add kind of more of a mocha vibe. That might get to be a bit intense, but you could do it. Don't let me stop you. There are a lot of different things that you could play around with if you want to add in some kind of crunch, if you want to add in some nuts or something. There are a lot of ways that you could adapt this to kind of make it your own. All right, thank you so much for watching this. I really hope you loved this tutorial, both with the design and decoration of these Macs, and then also with this Swedish latte inspired buttercream. Please let me know if you give it a try. The entire process, the buttercream, the design, anything like that. I love seeing your work. Make sure to tag me on Instagram at Maddie Brame. And if you're not already following down below, make sure to hit that subscribe button so I can see you here again next time. Until then, have a wonderful day. Bye.